Microphone test for school board work session, December 9th, 2024.
Good evening. The time is now 5:30. The Wayzata Public Schools Board of Education special work session for Monday, December 9th, 2024 will please come to order. Let's go around the table for introduction. We'll start from my right.
Sheila Pryor.
Dan Ginestra.
Sarah Johansson.
Valentina Ayers.
Chase Anderson.
And I am Milind Sohoni. Thank you and welcome everyone. The only item on the agenda is the Finance and Operations reports. Executive Director of Finance and Operations, Scott Lesage, and Dr. Ray Queener from Teamworks will present an update on attendance area adjustments. Gentlemen.
Perfect. Thank you, Board Chair Sohoni, board members, and Superintendent Anderson. The district received feedback from the input team based on their meeting last Wednesday, December 4th, along with the public feedback that closed last Friday at 5 p.m. The design team met this morning, and Ray and I are coming to the board and Superintendent Anderson with a preliminary recommendation. Ray and I will present the process and the preliminary recommendation.
Thank you. Good evening. Good to be with you again. Tonight we're going to do a quick update on kind of our current status, and then as Scott mentioned, we're going to walk through the preliminary recommendation that's on the table. So we've met again as a design team, I think 2 times since the last time I was before you. We also had another input team meeting, and we'll share some of that information. We also had another round of public feedback. We had approximately 300 responses across all of the models of that feedback. Again, our guiding change that's led us through this process. The recommendation you're going to see tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about the benefits and some of the challenges, but we've tried to meet as many of these as possible to a high degree. It's very challenging to do it to 100%, and it wasn't from a lack of trying. Many hours were spent and a lot of scenarios and what ifs to get to this point. So we still use our data system underneath to do that. I think hopefully we've demonstrated that the intent here is that this has been an open process. So we've provided opportunity for people to be engaged. The feedback has been honored and valued. Every one of the models that have come out into the public has reflected change that we received from the input. So even tonight, what we're recommending will demonstrate that we heard again from another round of interested parties in the school district, their feedback. And I think the district's also done a really nice job. I guess that's a biased comment. I think the district's done a really nice job communicating, keeping people abreast of where we're at in the process and what's happening. So we have formally had 12 design team meetings. There has been a data group we called that has met numerous times in between to help support the work of the design team. We did meet for about 2.5 hours this morning. And as a reminder, there's 30 members on that team representing district leadership, building principals, district administrators, to represent the entire district, including transportation. So transportation has been in the conversation since the very beginning. These are the official models or concepts that have been looked at. Even late Friday and into the weekend, there were still a couple of ideas being considered and talked about, but feel like we've landed on one that we think will meet as many of the needs as possible and be as responsive as possible to the feedback received. I do want to point out that even though the list here is comprehensive, there's probably, I don't know, I don't want to exaggerate, but at least 60 plus other what if situations that we have explored and tried. These are just the formal modeling that Teamworks provided the district. But even in our design team meetings, there was a lot of, what if we try this or what if we try that? And we would do some preliminary testing. So I can't think of a space or an area in the district that we haven't looked at or considered. We had our first input team meeting way back on October 8th. We commented to the input team that we had a gorgeous night on October for the first one. We had a very wet, rainy night on the second one, and we had winter on the third. So the input team actually navigated through 3 seasons of weather in this process. Last week, they gave us feedback on 2 elementary models, 8A and 8B-2, and middle school models 8A and 8B-2. And so we collected feedback from the group and compiled that information and combined it with the public feedback and brought that to the design team for their review over the weekend. I do want to point out that I received comments from the input team meeting, and Scott can add into this as well. There's a lot of appreciation between input team meetings on their feedback being heard and considered, and they saw that in the revised models that were presented last week. I think there was also some early indication of some preference on which they liked. And there were folks that were not 100% satisfied. You know, it's an imperfect situation to try to meet every single need and every single expectation. But I did receive a lot of positive comments at the meeting last week.
Yeah, I think I would just echo that. I think people understood, especially that input team, which we're extremely appreciative of their time because that's time away from their families and it's in the evening. And as Ray alluded to, we couldn't promise perfect weather. So we really appreciated their feedback at the end. I think they even kind of collapsed at the end. I think they understood the complexity of this process, and it's just not quantitative data, it's qualitative data. It's mixing a lot of different variables. It's trying to look into the future a little bit, but understanding that we can't control so many different, but yet we are expected to react to them and do it quickly.
The themes from the public were summarized. Again, we used artificial intelligence to help capture all the comments. We looked at themes. We also, I also asked to have those themes expanded with additional information. And I also asked ChatGPT to give us some examples. And so in the feedback that will be posted, the summary feedback, you'll see that data that the design team received. It gives not only the themes, but also illustrative examples of where it's collecting the data. As I mentioned, we had 373 responses on one of the models. So that tells me that 373 people looked at all of them, although they didn't all offer comments on each model. Here's an example of what that looks like. So you have, this is an example of feedback on model 8A. So you've got a summary of the themes and then also some specific examples that were illustrated in the feedback from the public. And so you can see that they not only had the themes, they had the examples to connect it. And the same thing for ideas for improvement. So all of these for all the models will be posted, if not today, the first thing tomorrow on the district website. So again, as Scott mentioned, the complexities of doing this work, the goal trying to balance capacities to around 90% of the functional capacity, being aware of the demographics of all the schools. The hope was to try to move toward district averages as much as possible, maintaining neighborhood schools as much as possible, trying to keep developments and neighborhoods together. In elementary and middle school pathway, we heard again a desire to have pure elementary feeders. We tried many ways to do pure elementary feeders into the middle schools. With the limitations of the capacities, primarily at East and West, that just is not doable under the current building size. Paying attention to roadways. We also paid attention as best as possible for the proximity to schools from neighborhoods. And I mentioned a couple of times, if we could pick buildings up and move them, you know, that would help out a great deal, but that's not a possibility here. And so while we paid attention to it, there were places where it was just not manageable to be able to do that. And then, as I mentioned, Rich was with us from transportation, and we were always talking about impacts and efficiencies. So one of our goals is try to improve transportation efficiencies from present day. So the team is recommending to the school board and the superintendent a model, concept 8B5. We're going to walk through that, talk a little bit about the differences between 8B5 and our previous 8B-2. The numbering sequence tells us that we were in Model 8. It was a different version, so Model B, and it's the 5th iteration of Model B. So we looked at 8B1, 2, 3, 4, and this is now 5. So it's a continuation of the Model 8B. I think one thing I will say before we talk about 8B5 is that we did have one other model that we were still carrying into last week, Model 8A. Model 8A, the desire was to try to have as contiguous boundaries as possible. And so when you look at the 8A map, you'll see that. The idea was to try to balance or create that neighborhood school impact as much as possible. But 8A also moved the most students. We received a lot of concern from the input team and from the public about 8A because of the large amount of movement. And it moved neighborhoods that had previously or even just recently been moved. And so when we took all of that into effect, and the fact that Wayzata Public Schools is still growing and the potential to grow even more significantly exists, decided to abandon that pursuit of that model. So that's not on the table, but that's where it resolved, is that we just didn't have a viable model that would meet especially all the input and the feedback we received.
Yeah, I think it was an attempt at trying to create those nice contiguous lines and start to formalize that part. But, through this process, the recognition came that there's just an enormous amount of potential development still to come, and the district's just not at that point yet.
I might just add one point of clarification too, is that I think what's being brought here tonight is a preliminary recommendation. And just as a reminder, we're zeroing in on a special school board meeting Wednesday, December 18th at 7 p.m., where we'll make any final refinements between now and then and bring the recommendation to the board for action at that point.
So because this is coming to you new today, fresh from the work over the weekend and yet today from the design team, we're going to take a few moments and just walk through the report. The vast majority of the report is unchanged in terms of the background and context, so I won't spend a great deal of time. But I do want to illustrate a little bit of how the design team looked at this data and what they were trying to do as they navigated these concepts. Again, the first part of this is unchanged. The need that was driving all of this is a capacity issue. I'll talk about this again in a few moments, but we went back to the current reality report, which is our very first report of projections with nothing changed. And the model that's the preliminary recommendation tonight has addressed every one of those concerns from a capacity standpoint. So it's looked at every building and addressed those capacities for balance. In different ways across the time, but every one of the schools that we looked at has been addressed. The guiding change we already talked about. This is unchanged from the previous report. And again, we want to highlight that really the design team struggled with one of the pieces where if we were designing something for 3 years, it might steer us down one path. If we were designing it for the second 3 years, it's a different path. But when you look across the 5 years, you see a lot of ups and downs in enrollment. And when you make a change in a boundary, are you moving those lines, all of them, up or down? And so we're trying to find the middle of the line to get between 90 and 100%, especially at the elementary. it was really challenging to stay under 100 at East and West Middle School because your middle school capacity, your middle school numbers are pushing your buildings to and beyond capacity. That is what your current configuration looks like on page 4. And a couple of things to note, there were several pocket boundaries that existed in the school district up in Greenwood. One in Kimberly Lane, Oakwood had a pocket boundary. A couple of places had 2 pocket boundaries. And so the idea was to bring balance and try to remove some of the pocket boundaries. Skip that. One of the things that we did in every iteration is take a look at the demographic table on page 6. The capacity information at the top is a 5-year look at this. So when you're looking at concept 8B5, when you see the low enrollment and the high enrollment numbers, those are 5 years out. And as that tells a picture, but it doesn't tell the whole story. You really have to look at the school by school analysis on how do we get from today to 5 years out. And then we also looked at the current demographic profile of each school, each model. We looked at the same profile, and we had the district averages that were in the table up above, so we could see how we were comparing from current day to projected models. So this last iteration came from 8B4, and it's 8B5, and they're the changes from 8B-2. I know these are hard to say quickly, so I have to slow down. 8B-2 to 8B5. There were 5 changes that occurred in that model.
What's that?
You talk about them, or you want me to?
Yeah, no, we can come up. So, all right. So looking at, I wonder if we want to go to that slide quick. Perfect. So when you look at 8B5 and you compare it to 8B2, some of the shifts in there, and I know 8B2 isn't up there, but there was a pocket inside of Northwoods towards the top that was removed. And then also that top portion that now says KL for Kimberly Lane, that was also shifted. That was at Northwoods, and that is an area that there's a tremendous amount of growth still potentially to happen. And then another shift on it was, you can see a section of Gleason Lake was expanded a little bit. And then we also had, trying to remember all of them, we also had on Kimberly Lane, the top portion, there was part that was kind of taken off and put into Kimberly Lane that was at Meadow Ridge, that was put back. So those are kind of the highlights right off the bat.
And the 5th one was in the middle level model, this now has 100% of Oakwood going to west. In the previous model, it was 70%. No change to east. East has got Sunset Hill, Plymouth Creek, and a part of Kimberly Lane.
Yeah, 30%. And we did model that out. So that spent our weekend doing a lot of the modeling and stuff. But we did attempt to try different percentages to east, as Ray and Chase alluded to. We have size limitations at both of those schools. So we don't really have a lot of variability in either of those buildings. So even when we went up to 50%, hearing some of the feedback, it put East in a situation that it would not be able to handle that sort of capacity.
So to talk a little bit about, so what happens at a design team meeting, usually what we have is a large map that we put on the wall, and the design team will look at the current concept and they will offer suggestions or edits to that or changes to that. We have the ability to run some short-term data analysis so that we can identify how many students, the profile of students in the area that's being proposed. And so we would go through that iteration until we landed on some changes or revisions to the map. And then when the new version comes out, the team would take a look at each of these school by school analysis. And so there's a lot of data here. And I want to just point out a couple of things. One, in the top chart, you'll see, we're looking at Birchview here, you're going to see 2 lines. The bottom line in that line chart is what we call cohort survival and birth rates. So if there's no new development, that's what we would project Birchview's enrollment to be. The blue line on the top is when we add in development in that area. And so, well, that's not a guarantee, it is a projection. We have modeled for Wayzata all developments that we know about as of today to be built out in 5 years. That may or may not happen. So the real line could actually approach that blue line. It may not get there depending on how fast developments are built out, what happens with the economy and all those other factors. But that's kind of the range. And so we were trying to keep, in many instances, those two lines at around 90%, but trying to keep them under 100%. That's kind of the target that we were aiming for. The table on the left-hand side, the Setting 3 SDC programming, we also were monitoring how many students are placed in that building in an SDC program. And then you can see in the middle of the page, the projected facility utilization, both at the 5-year and the 10-year marks, based on the current capacity, the functional capacity that's right under the table. The bottom table is the demographic profile. You have the current building's profile. You have the profile if this change, if this concept was applied to today's students. Because we don't project demographics, we just take a look at what happens if we implemented the model. The difference, how that compares to your other elementary schools and how it compares to your district averages. So every time we made a suggestion or ran a new concept, all of this data was evaluated and looked at to see whether or not that fit with our parameters in the guiding change and the desired variables. So I won't go through each of these. I just wanted to walk you through how the team utilized that data. And as we walk through the schools, you're going to see that for the most part, the two lines, by the way, if there's not a big difference between the two lines, it just means there's not a lot of development there. But go ahead.
Yeah, I think I would just point out, just because you have Gleason Lake up, Gleason Lake would be an example of one that we purposely left a little bit of capacity, because we'll get to it when we get to Kimberly Lane, but this would be one of the buildings that we would try to keep capacity so that we would be able to shift some of those pocket boundaries as new developments come online.
Then we have Greenwood, and you can see that Greenwood's blue line, if it's fully developed, is pushing the 100 or slightly over 100% in the 5 years. And again, as Scott's mentioning, there's an idea or strategy that would be implemented in how to balance new developments that are coming online if that blue line is materializing.
Exactly. So that would be one of the things the district would stay consistent to what we've done previously, and that is sticking to some of the pocket boundaries, as we mentioned, recognizing that we still have a lot of growth to happen. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice. But we recognize that it would allow us some of that ability to take on growth that we can't necessarily predict, or as Ray said, if the economy changes, if rates go down, or if there is some increased permits issued, it would allow us to kind of fluctuate some of those capacities to send some of those newer developments into schools that have capacity. So this would be a great example of that. When you look at this, you would go, why would you go that route? If you recall, when you looked at the map from 8B5 on the top portion there, where the KL is, where there's still a lot of development to happen, that would be, it's titled KL, and that's where the kids currently there would go. But as new developments come online, that's where the district would enact a purchase agreement date, or whatever the language would be, that would allow us to shift kids to buildings that have open capacity. So we would never let it get to this point where it's over capacity like that.
And you can see in Meadow Ridge and Northwoods, they're all hovering between, that 90 to 100% target that we were hoping for or aiming for. Oakwood, this is an example of where if we move a boundary for Oakwood, we move that entire line up or down. And so it starts out, you know, kind of in the 90 to 100%, and it grows, and it'll have to be monitored. But another adjustment either starts them below 90%, or if we move something else, it moves them up above 100. Plymouth Creek is another trend, school trending down. So again, if we move a boundary, we're gonna move those two lines up or down. And so you can see for the first 3 years, it's really kind of in the sweet spot, but the last 2 years, it starts to decline, and something may have to be addressed, again, if all of that materializes as projected.
Well, and this kind of highlights kind of the direction that we could forecast the district to potentially go depending on continued development, then that is pulling things towards the east, if that makes sense, because we're going to see potential enormous growth in the far west that's very undeveloped yet. So current boundaries would start shifting more to the east, if that makes sense, because we'd have to leave that space open for potential 10th elementary school and a 3rd middle school.
And Sunset Hill, again, the first couple years of the right in kind of that sweet spot of 90 to 100, but then dropping. So that may require adjustments in the future as well.
And I think that kind of talks to when we talked about some of the buildings, it's not just the quantitative data, it's looking at the qualitative data and taking into account the situations each building is in, the uniqueness of each of them. So that was absolutely discussed when we were going through these models as well.
We turn to middle schools, Central Middle School. Again, they have larger building. You can see the first few years there in that 90 to 100% space. And the same is true at East, with no change to building configuration. There's consideration for some modifications and reorientation at West that would accommodate that growth. In the first couple of years, they are still within range of what they can handle. The out years would require some additional space and reconfiguration, which I know the district's already talking about and working on. And this does bring in 100% of Oakwood to West. Did I say East, West?
Yep.
And we won't show you that. That map is in your packet, you have a high resolution 3D, not 3D.
That'd be impressive.
Wow, high resolution maps, and those two will be posted online for the public to be able to review.
I think I would just add, going back to, and Amy, you don't have to bring it up, but going back to the packet that Ray just went through, I think it would be really easy to look at and go, you know, grab 8B-5 and then grab our current situation and go, geez, they don't look a whole lot different. What did you guys do for all this time and all these meetings? But as Ray alluded to, when you look at the current situation and compare to that, we literally took care of essentially every situation we had, because if you recall looking at that, we had some serious problems that we were faced with. So although it looks very similar, I think there was wins in pretty much every category. And there's a ton of value in going through a process like this because, you know, we had community involvement. We had the input team, which was staff and community members, parents. We had the design team. I think it was a great thing to go through because we recognized a lot more about the district. And as we kind of alluded to, I don't think that we're ready for contiguous boundaries. We still have a ton of growth to go in our district.
So we looked at what are the benefits that this model, this concept provides. One, it addressed capacity at every site. That really was a fundamental driver in this whole conversation, is that you had buildings significantly over capacity, and that's what kept driving the work. 8B-5 minimizes the number of students and families that are impacted. You can't move attendance areas and not move families. And we constantly remind ourselves, our input team, our design team, that while we look at maps and we look at charts and tables, there's a family and there's a student on the backside of every one of the numbers. And so we paid attention to that, and you can't make changes without moving families to address capacity. But this one does have the minimal number of impacted. It does create a 3 to 5 year plan. It's somewhere in that range. You know, your middle school is your most pressing challenge from a capacity standpoint, but your elementary is not far behind. And that's just what the current growth that's projected. There was improvement in transportation efficiencies, so the reduction of pocket boundaries does create efficiencies, although not 100%, because there's still a couple of areas that require some pocket boundaries that require some transportation, dual transportation.
I think we tried to focus, just to build on that as an example, prior boundary areas where we had pockets, we would have 30 kids going to Oakwood, for example, and 22 kids going to Northwoods, while 2 different buses are going in there. And obviously, that's not the most efficient model.
I think it positions the district to handle future student growth, even though we're modeling all the development that we know about. We know there's potential for even more. And so just having that kind of as a horizon look was important, considering prior boundary changes. So we did hear from the input team and public that we just moved, or we just moved a year ago, or it was the second or third time we moved. And so we're trying to find concepts that minimize that. The demographics pretty much stayed consistent throughout the process, throughout the model. There was some progress toward neighborhood schools, recognizing it's not 100%. We did minimize elementary splits. We're down to 1. We tried many, many ways to have none, and it just does not work. And I think the model has been very responsive to the feedback from the input team last week, as well as the public feedback the ensuing days. But, and I know Dr. Anderson will talk about this, even with benefits, there's still imperfections, because there's still challenges. So there's still pocket boundaries that help mitigate the number of moves, but it doesn't help with our transportation efficiencies. The district might continue the practice of assigning schools based on purchase agreement dates. And we know if there's a new school, there's a potential that folks that are moved may be moved again when that school opens. If it is 5 years out, the students in the elementary or middle school ages will have matriculated through. They may have a sibling in the family that might be impacted, but trying not to move kids twice in their same grade span at the elementary or at the middle. We mentioned the transportation, and as hard as we tried, it's impossible to meet all expectations of interested parties. We did take it seriously. We talked about them all, and it's this, if you give this, you have to take this away, and invariably, no one wants to move, but in order to balance capacities, there has to be some movements. So this concept will be posted on the website. We talked this morning about the importance of getting feedback, giving folks an opportunity to provide feedback on this. So there will also be a feedback form provided. We will summarize that data and provide it to the school board. Our intent is to do that by Friday, December 13th. And as Dr. Anderson mentioned, right now the board's slated to take action on the recommendation December 18th at 7 p.m. So with that, we'll use the same practice as we have in previous updates and workshops. All the hard questions go to Scott. I'll take no, I'm kidding.
Thank you both. Scott, is he still your friend?
I thought so.
Okay.
I'm kidding.
All right. Thank you so much. Board colleagues, any questions, comments, concerns? Dan?
So you spoke about transportation and efficiencies. Could you kind of speak to that a little more? I noticed that there are some boundary lines that get to be a little bit unique. Birchview being kitty corner with itself in Minnetonka and so on and so forth. So just to elaborate on that more.
Well, the easy one is to talk about pocket boundaries. So when there's a pocket boundary, you have to run a bus from that pocket boundary to that school. And if a pocket boundary is residing in another school's attendance area, it's not the most efficient. So when we started this whole conversation, when we looked at all the different pocket boundaries, there was a lot of buses going in that were from different schools in different areas. And so we were trying to minimize that. And we have a fair amount, just not eliminated it.
I might just add too, if I may, one thing that somewhat offsets that a little bit is if you are able to get a most appropriate number of students in the buildings, your staffing efficiencies might go up a little bit, even if your transportation ones may go down a little bit. So it's hard to put that into a perfect metric to calculate what the savings might be or what the cost might be, but there are some counterbalancing efficiencies that I think happen as well.
Thanks. I had a comment, first of all, that I do feel that this process was transparent and that you did take feedback and that feedback was entered into the model and you looked at, so much feedback. And that the resulting proposals have been kind of, we don't have a whole lot of other choices. So I guess I feel confident that you did explore all avenues and that there were many opportunities for people to give their feedback. I am looking at the maps, and this is a new map that we're just seeing tonight, and I'm trying to kind of figure out the differences. And I'm wondering if, when you guys have time, is it possible for you to do an overlay of the old boundaries over the new ones? I kind of found some areas that are, that I can see have changed, but as Scott mentioned, this is kind of similar to what we already have with the pocket boundaries moved out and maybe a little corner of one area and another. So I'm having a hard time seeing where we actually made changes.
Can I project? Okay.
Oh, here. Oh, you got your time.
This will not be a perfect overlay, but it might be able to give you what you're looking for.
And just to also comment that I know, geographical area, the size of geographical area does not equate to number of students. You can have, a higher density of families living in a smaller area. So it's kind of hard for me to tell what's going on and how much we gained in one area and lost in another.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is some spots that were big areas that we moved even from 8B-2 to 8B-5 that really, there's not a whole lot of people in there. Where you look in geographically, it looks really big and there's nine students in there. And then you'll see other pocket areas that look really small and there's 81 students in there.
So one of the things that I do when we do modeling is I create a duplicate PDF and I put all the maps together so you can toggle back and forth. So that's what we're looking at here. Mm-hmm. Here's your current configuration. And as I toggle to 8B-5, you can see some of the changes. If we start in the kind of the northwest corner, we go back and forth, you're seeing a lot of changes on the pocket boundaries that are there today. You have a Gleason Lake, couple of Gleason Lake pocket boundaries. You have that northwestern part of the district that goes up. That's Oakwood. You got some Northwoods. So then if we drop down, you see a change to Northwoods, pretty significant change. Meadow Ridge is pretty close, a couple of changes there. Kimberly Lane changes a little bit to the west, which shifts that part of that Greenwood space. So when we move Northwoods over, then you pick up some of the Greenwood. Gleason Lake is fairly similar. There's a little bit more of that former Gleason Lake portion that's now going to Oakwood. Oakwood stays pretty consistent except for that northern portion. Gleason Lake pretty much stays the same except for the removal of the pocket boundaries in the northwest corner. Birchwood is close. There's one little change to the south of Oakwood, kind of southeast corner. You'll see the change to Birchwood. Birchview. Thank you. Sunset Hill currently has that little portion that goes south along 494. That has been moved to Birchview in the 8B5. And then we continue north. Plymouth Creek's changed. No, Plymouth Creek has not changed. Kimberly Lane's changed. The pocket boundary stays the same, but the part of the northwest corner of Kimberly Lane, you can see that changed in that model. So a lot of shifts in the model. I'm sorry, I don't have a way to overlay it on top of it.
That was helpful to see it kind of toggled back and forth like that. Looking at Northwoods, they've gained back the neighborhood that was going to Oakwood, and I don't know. I mean, you said all the buildings will be under capacity, so I believe you. I guess we had some overcapacity schools, and that was not one of them. And we have since, helped the ones that were too full. So when you see a school pick up something like that, we can rest assured that we're not creating another problem somewhere else. Okay. Sorry, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, but
Yes.
Thank you for your work.
Yeah, Sarah.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the design team and to everyone that put a lot into this. I know it's a lot. So I have a question, just to make sure I'm understanding. When we looked at the graphs when we looked at the birth rate cohort versus the development cohort, right, and kind of where that tracked, one of the questions that I have is where was it in one of those two where we factored in housing turnover? So in our district, although we're saying our students are growing and growing, right, and we're over 12,000, and that's great, we have 70% of our district roughly that don't even have kids in school. And and we know with real estate turnover that can happen. And so where do those numbers fall in our modeling?
So the short answer is it's in there.
Okay.
And then I can give you the technical answer. The cohort survival plus birth rate calculation follows a 10-year trend. So it looks back 10 years and says, what's happened between last year's third graders and this year's fourth graders? And we average that across the 10 years. So your average sales and conversion is in there. Okay. And it also includes an element of growth. So the cohort survival projection model, which is a trend line projection model, captures all the variables that have happened in the previous 10 years on average. And then what we do is we look at, so what's happened in the past 10 years on the development side compared to what's projected on new development. And so the new development then is the one we're seeing added on. The last comment I'll make is that we also monitor sales, housing sales. And if there's a neighborhood that we're watching, for example, when I was in a district, we had a neighborhood that turned over. Mm-hmm. All empty nesters turned over to single families. And so 50 kindergarten students showed up that weren't projected. So our system now has the ability to monitor that. So if we're seeing turnover or changeover, then we can dig into for more information. Okay. But the bottom line is it's in there.
Okay. And if I can just add on to that, I think about that, right? Like when we look at our Sunset Hill modeling, we don't have a lot of opportunity for new growth, but we have a whole bunch of really great starter family houses that could very easily turn over. And we know at least in the last 5 years or so with interest rates, and maybe things haven't been turning over as much. And so good to know that it's in there.
And if we start to see a lot of sales and we're generating a lot of awareness of that happening, then we can dig deeper to find out what are those sales? Are they sales to young families? And if so, what's the magnitude of that?
Okay, thank you.
I think this just kind of highlights the complexity of the whole process, Sarah, just like you had mentioned. It is a challenge when you're trying to balance everything out. I'll just add, talking about the state birth rates, I think it's very well known it is declining in Minnesota. And I will just say, as I've said several times during budget presentations and during the levy presentation coming up, that we're very lucky to be in a district where I know these are challenges. This is a big challenge, but, and Ray probably can attest to it, districts he works with as well, but most districts are contracting, they're declining, they're stagnated, they're closing buildings. So we are very lucky to live in a district that we are seeing growth because that isn't statewide. So although this is definitely a challenge and not taking anything away from that, this is a good problem to have, and it's a good problem for our budget as well. It's a good problem which then translates into opportunities and programs for our students and our community.
Well, thank you so much. It really means a lot. It's been a lot of hours of work, I'm sure, and a lot of engagement and whatnot. So your caretaking in this process really does mean a lot, and I think it will certainly pay off. I did have two final questions for you. So, looking at page 3 in the introduction section. You say, as we go to full screen here for viewers, it's 2,000 new housing units within the next 3 to 5 years. So how that estimation is arrived, and then 750 additional students attending Wayzata Public Schools, that estimate, how it is arrived.
So the district, well, Teamwork subscribes to a national development database that monitors all developments across metropolitan areas. They call it Metro Study. And so all school districts in the 9-county metro area, all the developments that are in those 9 districts are monitored by a third party of which we subscribe to that database. And they're monitoring them on a quarterly basis. So if we were to open up the online system, we could click on a development and tell you how many units have been built out of what is the total capacity. What that does is saves a great deal of time from district staff having to go out and talk to developers and city planners and gathering all that data and trying to come up with their own projections. So we just been using the Metro Study data. So there are 2,000 new housing units that are slated to be built out. And again, for this modeling, we're assuming that all happens in 5 years. We then take a look at, by elementary attendance area, the yield, the ratio that we will see from a single family home, from a apartment complex, from condos, on how many students come to the school district, come to Wayzata Public Schools from each of those areas. And no two developments are the same, no two elementary attendance areas are the same. And so that calculation, when you add up all of those new units, times those ratios, yields to 750 additional students.
That's a lot of good information. Thank you. The final question I did want to ask was, and this involves, I'm sure, a little bit of speculation, so maybe perhaps a little bit out of our comfort zones, but is there kind of a sort of design for if we were to build that 10th elementary, that 4th middle school kind of, is there a design to the boundary lines that makes, drawing that 10th attendance area, that 4th attendance area for the middle schools easier? Was that kind of set into motion?
I'll start, Scott can add. I think the idea with the design team was that we know where the district property, where the district owns property, but it's not a guarantee. There's not been a question put before the board or put before the public. So it's like we designed with a look at the horizon of a possibility without a guarantee. And so if it happened, what would be our what would be our planning? And so we start kind of in the southeast corner and worked our way counterclockwise, because if there is a new elementary or a new middle school and it's in the northwest corner, we wanted to provide as much stability across the rest of the district as possible in preparation for new buildings, if and when that would happen.
Thank you.
I think the only thing I would add is that's what I had mentioned earlier when one might come to the conclusion that the district will continue to pull east to the buildings as that develops west, if that makes sense. So you would see boundaries kind of shift a little bit to the west of where they are because we'd be pulling back to the east as that part of the district, especially the southern part, there's not the population or the growth that we will see in the north.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to give kudos for two things, express a concern for one, and ask a couple of questions. Kudos to you for, I don't know if it was you listening to me or everybody else, but changing the Birchview model and bringing it to where I think it's very, very equitable. So thank you for that. And then also, I think we started out at 20% of the students being affected in the very initial models, down to 7.5% now. So I think that's a very good improvement. I'm very happy with that. What I'm concerned about is the middle schools. In the next 5 years or so, even before that, maybe they're at 104, 105% capacity. So maybe the district should consider a middle school sooner rather than later, another one, if possible. And then the questions relate to map for 8B5, if you can bring that up on the screen. Okay. So the first question is about a comparison between 8B2 and 8B5. In the Northwood section, there was a little piece that was going to go to Meadow Ridge. And from what I heard from the community, that was going to be from Ravinia going to Meadow Ridge. And what they were saying is Walcott Glen is already, it's in Oakwood. Apparently they are not, and it was mislabeled as Oakwood. But now now we are going to have Oakwood come up, the ones from Walcott Glen come up to Northwoods. Is that, no? They are going to stay at Oakwood?
I think I know what you're asking. I believe that was in the Northwoods section that you're talking about. They would be going to Northwoods in this model. Is that
Walcott Glen, you mean, or Ravinia?
both?
Both. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that little crown part, that little part on the top was
Exactly.
was going to go to Meadow Ridge.
Yeah.
But now they are not going to go to Meadow Ridge.
Exactly.
Okay, good.
Perfect.
The second question I have on that map, we are looking at Kimberly Lane being at 104% capacity in a few years, and Plymouth Creek only at 87 or so percent. So why is that extreme northwest part of Corcoran, I don't know which neighborhood it is, going to go to Kimberly Lane now, and then maybe they will move to Plymouth Creek in 5 years? Help me understand that.
Yeah, I can understand that. We kind of what we talked about earlier, the Kimberly Lane part up top, when Ray was on that slide, it showed that they were going to increase just like you had mentioned. And that's where we said that wouldn't happen. And the reason that wouldn't happen is because we shifted that top part, that's KL on the map. Wish I had like a pointer. But the top portion that says Kimberly Lane, that says Kimberly Lane, but it's for the students that are currently there. So once we get to that capacity level inside of Kimberly Lane, that would become pocketed. And then those, depending on purchase agreement or whatever is determined by the board and the district, those new families would then go to a building that has capacity.
Okay, more likely Plymouth Creek, right? That would, that would be at 87% only.
I think it would all depend on where buildings were at, because as we know, things can change, variables can change quickly too. So I think we would look at where we would have capacity and then look at it from an efficiency standpoint with transportation as well.
Okay, but that small portion on the northwest corner there, that big rectangle, they more than likely will not be moving again in 5 years.
What portion is that?
northwest of Northwoods.
The KL mark.
KL.
I think it's highly likely. I guess I wouldn't want to answer because we don't know how that's going to grow out. So I wouldn't want to speculate at this point. That is a massively, I mean, there's a lot of expansion. My understanding is it's about 30% developed right now. And there's a lot of development to still be had in there. And then it all depends on what happens with Medina and the growth there. So I think it would be a little too early to speculate at this point.
Okay, all right, sounds good. And then one final comment. I think this movement will hopefully help class sizes, which is again my biggest concern. And like you said last time, it will all then depend on the staffing eventually, right? So let's hope all of those work out and we get a class size that is, at least I would like it to be better than it is right now. So thank you so much. Any other questions? All right, thank you both of you. And so now we are going to be, as Dr. Anderson said, Valentina, you had a question? No?
She didn't.
Okay. Okay. No, that's right. Okay. So as Dr. Anderson said, the board will be meeting again on December 18th. That will be the final.
Yeah, if you'd like me to just make a few summary comments, I can do that too.
Absolutely.
So just a few things that come to mind for me. First of all, I want to thank our presenters here tonight. Ray and Scott have worked really hard, and Jen Welk, who's sitting there on the side as well. And a very large team of people have looked at a whole lot of information and created a lot of different concepts, many of which you've seen, the community's seen, our leadership teams have seen, and I just really appreciate all the work that's gone into it. I think there probably has not been a neighborhood that we haven't looked at and considered and thought about, the what ifs of this and if we did that instead. So the preliminary recommendation that we brought forth tonight, I think, is very close to what eventually, and you've heard me use this terminology before, could be characterized as the best of the imperfect options. I think we could spend 6 more months looking. We would not find a perfect option that would be perfectly suitable to everybody. And you do kind of get to a point where, the return on investment of vetting different perspectives become increasingly difficult, I think. Given that, we did make a few tweaks for tonight and what we presented to you, and we're going to be sending that out in the morning. We will give consideration to that feedback, the inputs that we've received here from the board tonight. And another thing about this particular scenario, even though we don't have a perfect crystal ball, it's really hard to know what's it going to look like in 3 years or 5 years. We really don't know for sure. We can speculate. We know where our property is that we could build schools on if we chose to do so. We can kind of speculate a little bit that if and when it's known a school might be built, that tends to help get neighborhoods moving more quickly, I think, in response to that. And I think this plan, or a close derivative of it, really positions us probably about as well as we can, given imperfect ability to forecast exactly what the future is going to look like. So from that perspective, based on what I've heard and the involvement I've had along the way, I think this particular concept is pretty good. I do appreciate all the variables and that were considered and that are really included in this scenario. The things that we continuously heard back from the community was, move as few kids as possible, do your best to align neighborhoods with proximity to the school and those types of things. And I think this particular model probably achieves the greatest number of those. And we did get to a point where you do, and we've had to do this before in these approaches where you get close to the point where you need to wrap it up because we have the whole school year to plan next year. We need to know where kids are going to be and how to staff that building and how to create transportation lines. I don't feel that we're being excessively rushed to hit that timeline, and that is causing us to come up short in regard to giving consideration to all the feedback that we've had. But the reality is we start working really hard on next year now, but especially by February 1st and even late January. So I've really appreciated all of the feedback, as I know others have as well, the feedback from the board and the community and from our leadership team. Building principals have been very involved with this, and as you alluded to in your introduction for me to make a few comments is we'll plan on coming back here to this building Wednesday, December 18th, 7 o'clock, where we'll fine tune a recommendation driven, I think, pretty closely to the one that you've seen tonight, and make a recommendation like we do for all action items on what the administration would be looking for the school board to do that night. I mentioned the timeline, so I won't go through that all that much more in the critical nature of just being sure that we finished in a good, timely manner. And we recognize that along with this, that change is always very difficult. None of us have really enjoyed going through this all that much because we know, as Ray said, I don't know your exact terminology, but we know it's more than just lines on a map. It's impacts kids and families and relationships and connections. And we've done this before, and we know how to be responsive to new students and new families into a different school or a new school. And I just have the highest of confidence in our building principals and the teachers and the staff at each one of our schools that once we know what the game plan is for next year and hopefully the next 3 to 5 years, I know principals will roll up their sleeves and roll out the welcome mat and make sure that they do everything possible to help welcome new students and families into their building. So just again, thank Ray and Scott and Jen for their work on crunching the numbers and making the presentation tonight and also along the way. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Again, one more time, thank you, Ray, Scott, Jen, and also the many volunteers that provided input, also the design team. It obviously takes a village, right, to do this. So thank you so much. And I think, I don't know if it's a record time or not, but 4 months is a pretty darn good turnaround time for when we started in July as a board to now in December. So I appreciate everything that you've done, and let's hope things go well on December 18th. Thank you so much.
So if I may just make one final comment that I forgot to make. What I described, does that seem to resonate with you as board chair and what we should do for December 18th?
I do. You and I discussed the possibilities of other dates, maybe perhaps doing it in January, but I think I agree that we don't want to push this to January. December is probably a good time, and if Ray can be here on the 18th, we will try our best as a board. I personally won't be here. I will be out of the country, so I have to let you know that I will not be attending that meeting. But I know my board colleagues are pretty darn good and very able to make that decision on behalf of the board. So yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
And Ray can be here that night, so.
Okay, this completes our work session for this evening, and the work session will be followed by our regular school board meeting at 7 p.m. The time is now 6:33. The Wayzata Public Schools Board of Education special work session for Monday, December 9th, 2024 is adjourned.